Namaste. We are beginning today a new series, Open Conversations. It is a series of videos containing free-flowing and more spontaneous conversations around thematic subjects of interest. Our theme today is spirituality and unconscious. Let us have this conversation with our psychoanalysis consultant, Mr. Himanshu Vaidya. Namaste, Mr. Vaidya.
Namaste.
Mr. Vaidya, is unconscious important in spirituality?
Spirituality essentially is about two things, self-knowing and self-transformation. And any person who goes on this path of self-knowing and self-transformation, today or tomorrow, directly or indirectly, without using the word or not using the word, has to deal with the unconscious mind. Whether you call it unconscious or not, that's a different issue. So in the Indian spiritual tradition, there is a concept of chitta. There is a concept of Sushuptaman. There is a concept of Avchetan. There is a concept of karmic load from the past, which determines our constitution. There is a concept of a mind higher than our own. There is a concept of nature in us, which works on its own without our consent or control. So all of these directly or indirectly are connected to what we call as the unconscious mind. And therefore, there is no way a person deeply exploring himself from a standpoint of self-knowing and self-transformation does not have to deal with the unconscious. So spirituality has to deal with the unconscious, and it deals with it very effectively, not in one, but in hundreds of ways. It has its own understanding, terminology, a basket full of tools to manage and transform the unconscious. It may not use the word unconscious, it may use different words based upon the culture or the theological language that it uses. But definitely it has to deal with the unconscious. In fact, if you look at Indian spirituality, there is a volume of literature on how to purify the unconscious. And there are a basket full of tools to do it. And these are quite different from the tools and approaches we use in classical psychoanalysis. If we look at enlightened masters in spirituality and in their autobiography and in their writings, it is very clear that they had to struggle very deeply and intensely for a very long time with their own unconscious mind and the desires and fears of the unconscious mind. We can take up any person's biography or autobiography, any enlightened master, and it always comes up. So there is no question of spirituality not dealing with unconscious. In fact, knowing and transformation of the unconscious is one of the central tasks of spirituality. And on this point, the objective of spirituality, psychoanalysis, psychology, all of them on this point converge. Of course, they are not the same. Spirituality is very different from philosophy, theology, and psychoanalysis. But on this particular point of self-knowing and self-transformation, they all converge. Transformation into what? On that they differ. But when it comes to knowing one's pathology and purification of pathology, they all converge. So spirituality definitely deals with the unconscious.
Now, when we talk of unconscious, somehow immediately the connection of the word pathology comes into mind.
Right.
So, is spirituality all about just dealing with the pathology of the unconscious?
No. In fact, pathology in spirituality is a minor part. The real part is transformation of your normalcy and establishing a new normal of the supernormal. In classical psychoanalysis, what happens is that anything that is not conscious or pre-conscious goes into unconscious. And the limitedness of psychoanalysis is that it does not go into parapsychology or the human potential zones. So when we look at the mind from human potential point of view, or from parapsychological point of view, or from shamanic point of view, or from hallucinogenic point of view, right, or from transpersonal point of view, many other things come up than what is discussed in psychoanalysis. So uh, the unconscious is almost like a blanket word in psychoanalysis to cover up a variety of things. Therefore, the unconscious need not necessarily be pathological. The positive parts also are clubbed into what is called unconscious in psychoanalysis. The issue is that since it is a healing science, not really a potential discovery science, it's not a human potential movement science, it's essentially a pathology healing science. And given that background, it focuses on the pathological part of the unconscious, not on the normal part or the supernormal part. And therefore, uh, in normal discourse, it has de facto got communicated to all of us that unconscious essentially is pathological, which is not true. One part of the unconscious has pathology, another part is very normally functioning, and then there are supernormal entities associated also with the unconscious. And when we look at spirituality, it looks essentially at the pathological part of the unconscious, not as a subject of study or the real focus, but only as a roadblock to be cleared. Whereas the goal essentially is the making the supernormal state normal state, establishing a new normal. So self-transformation towards a supernormal state is what is the goal of spirituality, and pathology is engaged with as a necessary evil more in the perspective, in more from a standpoint of clearing the roadblocks rather than making that the center of study.
I think that is where psychoanalysis and spirituality, I mean, kind of go apart, diverge. Right. So now, as you said, unconscious has positive parts also. So what about the positive parts?
Uh, the positive parts pertain to many things. One is the everyday functioning, the normal functioning. Second is the whole idea related to morality, the spirituality, and the occult powers. It also pertains to helping somebody on the spiritual path. Dream analysis becomes one important element of it. Using of certain spiritual techniques to harness the power of the unconscious mind on the positive side, not for healing pathology, but to enhance one's potential. So that is where the power of the unconscious is used. And you have a variety of tools of giving suggestion to oneself when one is going to sleep, or giving auto suggestions to the unconscious mind to do certain things. Using visualization techniques, idol therapy techniques, mantra techniques, certain rituals, both shamanic and non-shamanic, because in India you have less of shamanic rituals and more of the Vedic rituals. So all those elements are to really harness the positive part of the unconscious. And when it comes even to healing pathology, in many approaches, the positive part of the unconscious, the positive power of the unconscious is used to counter the negative power of the pathology, which also is in the unconscious. So it is the healthy part of unconscious versus the unhealthy part of unconscious. The part of unconscious which helps us in spiritual evolution or change our habits by auto suggestion, by auto talk, by visualization, mantra, and all of those techniques. This and many other techniques are used. Even breathing techniques, yogic techniques are used. Certain pranayam techniques are used. to harness certain elements of the unconscious for our benefit. Even food items are used in the sense that uh, the connection is from the food to the gut biome and from the gut biome to the nervous system. And that connection is used in terms of certain dietary conditions, certain herbal medications, and so on to harness and mobilize the positive power of the unconscious for our goals, and in this case, spiritual goals.
Uh, when we talk about spirituality, I think automatically some images of saints or enlightened people or masters, come to the mind.
Right.
So, how about them and their unconscious? I mean, can we talk about that?
Yes, because the normal understanding is that once somebody becomes enlightened, at least in India it is so, we just place him in a extraterrestrial orbit above the earth. And we believe as though he does not have any unconscious mind. Everything has become conscious and everything is light and clear. But actually it is not so. What is called enlightenment experience is not one. There are variety of experiences which are clubbed under the name of enlightenment. Certain things are common. For example, uh, substantial freedom from desire and fear, experience of the state of no thought, a kind of experience of causeless bliss. These are common experiences, but after them, other experiences come in where the difference comes. Some people experience oneness with existence. Some people experience a nirvanic kind of negation of everything. Some people experience a stillness. Some people experience only a state of no thought. Some people experience a kind of a sweet, warm feeling in the center of the chest. So different people experience what is called enlightenment differently. And based upon what is the kind of experience and how deep has the transformation been, uh, that is where the difference comes in. And this creates difference among many people. One group of people who have just experienced a state of no thought and bliss for some time and can call back that state on demand for some time, not permanently, but for some time, they also start calling themselves enlightened. And in their case, the unconscious is very similar to the unconscious of a normal person because the transformation is very low. Even without the transformation of the unconscious, these supernormal experiences can happen. But and because these experiences happen, one is able to interpret the scriptures very well because they were written by people who had these experiences. So once you have these rare experiences, you are able to interpret, understand, and live much better. And at times, it goes to your head and people fortify it. And you start passing yourself as an enlightened person. And in this group of people, there is no transformation at all of the unconscious. It's very much like any other God-fearing person or any other ethics-fearing person. This is one group. The second group is where the person has experienced a state of no thought, causeless bliss, and maybe even the sweet, warm feeling in the center of the chest, and oneness with the existence. Right? And there, the transformation may be 25 to 30% of the unconscious, but what remains unconscious, that does not overwhelm you to do anything evil. So that's a second group of people. I would call it a quarter transformation group. And then the third group of people where there is a 75% transformation of the unconscious. And the fourth group where there seems to be a 100% transformation of the unconscious. Now that is very, very rare. So you see the entire range from an unconscious mind, almost like that of any normal person, to what is claimed to be 100% transformation of the unconscious, and everything in between. The enlightened person can be anywhere, and based upon where he is, you can have no transformation, partial transformation, substantial transformation, or total transformation. So there is no one answer to it. We have to check out what is the kind of experience that he is claiming to have had under what he calls enlightenment, and how deep that experience has affected a transformation in the unconscious. Because one can easily have these rare spiritual experiences without transformation also.
So, in that sense, I mean, depending on the degree of transformation of the unconscious, do we have like categories like saints or masters or, like whom we call Buddha state or
Yeah.
things? Is there a certain gradation?
Yes. In some spiritual schools, they have put gradations. And they have used different names for it. Some people just have a binary. Either you are a sadhak aspirant or you are a realized person. And realized person, they mean 100% realized person. And in between all the states, they just call it states of a student. They don't really call you an enlightened person till the process is complete. That is one set of schools. There's another set of schools where there are intermediate recognitions like a graduation, a post-graduation, and doctorate.
Right.
So based upon what you have achieved, you are given certain titles, and these are different. In case of Zen, it's a binary. Either you are there or you are not. In case of schools which are in Jainism and Buddhism, there are gradations.
In Jainism, yes, because I think the whole of the Navkar mantra, which is the main foundational mantra, it goes from the top to the lower, I mean, hierarchically. In terms of the transformed person.
Yeah. So in terms of how much we have reached, there are different names. In classical ancient India, we used to have this whole idea of Rishi, Muni and Rishi.
Yes, yes.
Right. The intellectual and the half realized to the full realized. And then we had, similarly, we have a similar hierarchy in Tantra and Aghora. They have a hierarchy of I don't remember exactly the names, but something 3 or 4 or 5 categories. I think they have Nath, and then one more, and then Rishi and something. They have a category. But it's like 4 or 5 different categories based upon how much you have evolved. So there are different groups in some schools, and in some schools, they just look at a binary. Either you are completely there, completely transformed, or you are just a student. So based upon the schools and the culture, and I think in the Sufi order also, there is a kind of a hierarchy.
So essentially, I mean, it's about the experiences leading to transformation of the unconscious, which decides this gradation. It's not just experiences, but as you said, experiences which deeply transform the person.
Yes, very important, because see, if you don't have transformation after those rare experiences, chances are very high that you will end up being a narcissistic guru or even an exploiter. And many of the scandals that we see are of people who have had rare experiences but no transformation. Now, because of those rare experiences, they had certain insights into scriptures, into the area of spirituality, theology, and so on. And people, when they heard them or talked to them, they came out as far more clear and evolved compared to ordinary run-of-the-mill individuals. So people started respecting them, having reverence for them, and they got established as sort of gurus. But because the unconscious was not transformed, the scandal had to happen today or tomorrow. Because the pathological unconscious, which is untransformed, is going to exert itself, just a question of time when it does it. So in that sense, I think if you Aurobindo's approach, they are very clear that it is not enough to have these experiences. The core is to bring these experiences down and transform oneself completely. Because that is the most important part in terms of your thoughts, words, and actions. Most importantly, actions. That the thoughts, words, and most importantly, actions are not transformed unless those rare experiences are brought down, the power of those experiences and the purity of it is brought down into all the chakras completely. So unless the whole personality is transformed, and in tantric lexicon we will say all the chakras are completely purified, the person is capable of doing anything anytime. So you have to be on guard with that person as much as you are on guard with any other person. So till the transformation is complete, the man is as unreliable as anyone else in the world. Because essentially, he is also in the grip of desires and fears like any other man.
Uh, Now we come to karma. I mean, the moment we talk about saints or masters or enlightened people, the question leads to the thought of karma. So, is there some connection between karma and the unconscious?
Yes, because one of the questions related to unconscious is how does it get created? Is it only because of experience of this birth, or is there some material from the past birth? And there we have two kinds of arguments. One is that very strongly felt or developed entities from the last incarnation, they come in this new incarnation. And they can be on the positive side, talents or inclinations towards knowledge or arts, or on the negative side, they may be too much of anger or too much of fear, or anything of that sort. Maybe too much of guilt or shame or envy or whatever it is. So that part is that one way of looking at it is that those traces, those inclinations, those qualities, and even the traumas they come in. And those traumas come in because of your past births. So this is a very transpersonal argument in this. Another element, of course, is the intergenerational transmission, which is biological. And to that also the karmic theory is applied, that it is happening because of the karmic load. So there may be a direct psychological transfer or through the genetic structure and intergenerational trauma transfer. And the third way of looking at it is that what we call our constitution, that is created in a particular way, that our uniqueness is not without reason. Our uniqueness is out of the law of karma. So we are what we are, our constitution is what it is because of the karmic cycle and our soul journey. And when we talk of this, the idea there is that the karmic cycle operates by having certain variables in certain ways. For example, take the process of evaluation in early life. It is the process of evaluation which generates affect. And affect generation is the core in any pathological movement. If affect is not generated in a very high quantum, there is no question of pathology. In most cases, I am not saying all problems are affect related, but in most cases. So let us say for affect generation, what is necessary are three different things. One is evaluation of some phenomena as being a very intense phenomenon. If the intense phenomena is not evaluated as intense, it won't generate that effect. Second is sensitivity. How much do you feel for a unique event in the real world? And third is the life energy that you have. How much of life energy is available for this emotional process? Now, by just varying these three variables, the law of karma can easily lead to almost inevitable traumas in childhood. If the sensitivity is very high, if the evaluation is such that it evaluates events as very intense, and if the life energy is high, and if the defensive structures are weak, the mother not being available for a few hours can also get converted into a feeling of object loss, which another person would not feel as object loss. He would feel it's a very normal phenomenon. So the law of karma has to operate only 3 or 4 variables, and then the intense phenomena of object loss happens, even when the external world is not so difficult. And from the single phenomena of object loss, so many pathologies come up, and these pathologies in turn create next difficulties. It's almost like the French novel, La Miserable, that one small thing leads to another tragedy, and that tragedy leads to 10 other tragedies. So the karmic law has to only create enabling environment for the first tragedy, and then by the laws of nature, it just rolls on. So that is where the karmic linkage comes. And just as on the negative side, we also have the positive karmic linkage. It's not only negative. So some people have extraordinary psychological strength, very good constitution, that also is karma. Unfortunately, normally we think only of negative karma. But the positive, just as we don't think about the positive part of the unconscious, we usually don't think about the positive part of karma. Because all the good things in life that we have, if the karmic theory is to be believed, that also is partly due to karma.
We take them for granted, I think, so we don't count them.
Maybe that also is karmic. But and therefore this is very important, the whole karmic thing. And in certain holistic healing practices like pranic healing and Reiki, this is taken up very explicitly. Like in pranic healing, if somebody comes with a chronic difficulty, let us say a chronic arthritis or a chronic asthma or a chronic diabetes or a chronic OCD, any pranic healer will try to first gauge the cause of it, and they will try to find out how much of it is caused because of biology, how much because of emotion, how much because of thinking patterns, and how much because of the karmic load. And if they find out that the karmic load is quite an amount, they will suggest certain things to lessen the karmic load. So there is definitely a linkage of the karmic element with the unconscious, just as there is a linkage of soul and soul journey with the unconscious. Of course, we are talking in a believer's world. In strict psychoanalysis, all of this goes out of the window.
I was actually going to come to this point.
Yeah, but from a holistic point of view, these elements are very important elements. And not only are they recognized and measured in qualitative terms, but there is also a basket full of tools to manage them in the real world. So in holistic healing, there are many internally consistent systems which deal with this aspect of the linkage of karma with the unconscious. And yes,
Yeah.
in the yogic terminology, it's very clear. If you look at the model of mind of yoga, there are many models of the mind in yoga, but the classical model of the mind in yoga, you have an element in that model of the mind called the chitta. And the chitta is an unconscious mind, which is unconscious, but it has elements from past lives. So in that yogic model of the mind, there is an element of unconscious like in psychoanalysis. But unlike psychoanalysis, this is not strictly personal end of this life. So in that case, when you go into those kinds of model of the mind, I think the linkage is not only clear, the linkage becomes one of the central elements of that structure of the model of.
Even the word vritti, I think
Yes.
it's a very fundamental word like chitta vritti. I'm sure that also has something to do with your previous births, the karmic thing.
And just as you have chitta vritti, uh, you can also extend it to the reincarnational trauma. There is some very interesting research in the area of reincarnation. And that tells us that some of the difficulties are continuation or inheritance from other lives.
Even like in psychology these days, there's a lot of research and talk happening about transgenerational trauma.
Yes.
But then, of course, it doesn't talk about karma. I mean, it doesn't talk about it in a karmic way.
Yeah,
It does
because
talk about trauma being passed on from generation to generation.
yeah, so it is transpersonal, but it is not trans-incarnation.
No, even transgenerational, I think, is being researched upon.
Yeah, true. So that is a very scientifically proven thing now, that in the animal studies, it is very clear that there are transgenerational, which means transpersonal elements.
Right.
But this trans-incarnational elements, because in transgenerational, I get a problem from my father. Whereas in
Right.
transgenerational, I get a problem from my own past life.
Right. Right.
So
True.
both are transpersonal, but in different ways transpersonal.
Right.
So in reincarnational research, very good evidences are getting collected on some of the difficulties that we have, and they have come out to be, from their point of view, trans reincarnation. Like I was listening to one of the talks the other day of that reincarnational expert, and he gave an example, a proven example from, I think, Stevenson or somebody who has done quite a bit on this, where a person was born with either defective limbs or paralysis or something, and that was because in his past life he had worked very hard, and he wished that I have a life where I don't have to do anything. Now, of course, it needs to be rigorously proven, and all of that is true. But from what is there, these kind of things are there. And we also see in hypnotherapy, people use past life regression to cure that certain elements come from the past life. And there also we see that element of karmic thing or past lives coming into the present. So I think it's a very exciting area without taking a stand on its truth or falsity. I think it's a very interesting area to explore and see how it turns out.
Now, like when we talk of unconscious, the thing that comes to my mind is that when we respond to a situation, uh, the response is it by default or is it a conscious response? I mean, how is that determined?
Now, this is a very important element in spirituality because they want to substitute all unconscious responses, all default responses by conscious aware responses. In fact, many people make a difference between reaction and response. And they say reaction is something which happens by default automatically, and response is well considered. And this response is given other characteristics. One, that it is not a default response. It's not a default reaction. It's a response. And the response is not default. It's not automatic. It's well deliberated upon. And most importantly, it is free from the past. Now, when we say free from the past, we don't say free from the past in the cognitive sense. We say free from the past in an affective and judgment sense. That our feelings of the past and our judgments of the past don't transgress into our decision making in the present moment. In that sense, there is learning from the past, but no slavery of the past. And the present moment in that sense is a free moment, free from the past in affect and judgment terms. Now, that becomes one of the central elements of spirituality, that after doing sadhana, after having enlightenment or rare experiences, how to live, because ultimately it's actions speak louder than words, and everything is a preparation towards that, towards living after all. And this living has to be of response and not of reaction. It has to be free from habit and default and the rapid fire impulsive actions that we do.
So that means if the person is truly transformed after the experiences, then the response is always a conscious one, but it's not like really consciously kind of meditated upon, but it just comes naturally because the person himself is transformed.
Even if he accesses the past, he accesses the past as a master, and the past does not use him. He uses his past experience, but the past experience does not use him.
No, in the sense, what I'm trying to say is that suppose if the person is truly transformed through some experiences, and in a day-to-day life, someone just abuses him or something, him or her, whatever, then the reaction is a natural reaction out of transformation. It's
Yes,
not
true.
that kind of a default reaction as we say.
Yeah, because if the transformation is genuine, then
Right.
the psychological I has to cease to exist in the sense of becoming. Self-becoming has to cease in the sense the psychological movement to become something more in a psychological ordinary sense has to cease. So if someone says something abusive to him, the psychological ego has to be transformed. And if it is really transformed, it won't give the traditional habitual reactions.
Yes, yes, that's what I mean, exactly.
Because there is,
So,
in the normal sense of the term, there is no ordinary person there. And they say there is no one here. That is also not true. It is not that there is no one here. There is a biological I. And there is a cognitive I. But there is no affective I in the sense of interpersonal relationships. And there is no, at least, even if there is an emotional I, there is no negative emotion I. There is no difficult I at least. So this is a part of the transformation. If this does not happen, then obviously we have a person with some rare experience, but not with a transformation which has happened.
right. So, in this kind of a person who is truly transformed, so the response he or she gives to an outer situation, uh, what do we call it? I mean, do we call it a conscious response or a default response? Because his or her default response is also like a conscious response. I mean, I'm just trying to.
Yeah. So that by default response, we mean the ordinary way we respond.
Right.
And a conscious response is the response of a person who is transformed. Now, That
no, for a transformed person or for an enlightened person, in his case, I mean, default response and conscious response is one and the same thing, or is
yes,
it different?
the conscious response becomes his default response.
Right, yeah. Whereas in an ordinary person, two are different.
Yeah, because default response happens by default, and conscious response takes huge amount of effort, and we are not
Yeah.
able to be in that conscious state for a long time. It's too energy consuming and too troublesome. So even if we will to be conscious, we are overwhelmed in no time by the rest of the unconscious mind, and we are not able to continue being conscious. It's too energy consuming and too demanding beyond our capability. So, but there is a caveat here. When we say a conscious response, there again is a variety of responses that go under the name of conscious response. It may just be a spontaneous response of somebody who has surrendered himself completely to existence, and something just comes out. Or there may be a more conscious working of the mind, but clearly with an observer who is not overwhelmed by the past, where the person is using all his experiences, skills, and education, but he is not moved by feelings and judgments of the past. And third is that there is an awareness, and in that awareness, decisions are made, but still the past is operating in some low level of intensity, both in cognitive and affective terms. All the three are possible. So, despite having the rare experiences of what they call enlightenment, in some people, the unconscious field is substantially at work. May not be a very difficult unconscious, but still it is a judgmental unconscious based upon conditioning is still at work.
Are there some spiritual tools or practices for the unconscious
Uh,
to kind of
that is the main
change the unconscious?
that is the main employment of everybody in the spiritual world. How to create these tools and techniques to clean up the unconscious and to amplify the superconscious part of us. So there are hundreds of tools and techniques. In fact, there would be more than 10 to 25 techniques in each school, and there are hundreds of schools across the world. The most popular being those from India, Tibet, the Sufi Middle East, and Gurdjieff himself is almost an inventory of tools because he found out so many tools, and Indian culture is full of it. Like for thousands of years, one of the things that Indian genius has dedicated itself to is this whole business of developing tools. So we have tools of visualization, of mantra, of rituals, of taking certain herbs, of certain yogic practices in Hatha Yoga, certain breathing practices, alchemical processes in Tantra, very intellectually oriented processes in Buddhism, uh, very intense lifestyle oriented processes in Jainism, very intense dance and emotion oriented processes in some schools in India and some Sufi schools. Then you have very strange but inviting intellectual processes in Zen, the whole area of koans. Zen itself is like a house of koan. So spirituality has variety of tools, and not to mention healing techniques which are full detailed systems by themselves. Whether you talk of Tai Chi or you talk of pranic healing or Reiki, or you talk of certain parts of Ayurveda which now we don't know much about. These are very rich and effective basket full of tools in spirituality to deal with the unconscious and to deal with the normal and supernormal part of us.
Now we are talking about tools or certain practices and processes. There is surely a need of some kind of a guidance from somebody, in which we in spirituality we call under one name called guru or a guide. So
Yeah.
how, I mean, that becomes a very, I think it's the crux of the whole thing, because otherwise the tools are not really available to you.
True, because of certain reasons. Uh, in spirituality, very few people can pull it off without a guru, and they are called as Swayam Buddha, people who have attained Buddhahood on their own. But they are actually less than 5%. 95% of the people need a teacher or a guru. And this has many reasons. The first reason is it is not an exact science, it's an inexact science. So spirituality has not reached that level where it can be standardized and manualized and almost automated kind of thing. So you don't have a do it
I mean,
yourself.
I have, I mean, kind of an objection to when you say it's not an exact science, but it is an inexact science. I think it is experiential. So how can you really, I think it is very exact in that sense, in terms of understanding or learning through experiences or transmitting exact. It may not be exact in terms of facts and figures or empirical data and all that.
Yeah. So we don't understand the detailed mechanics of how the processes operate.
But still it happens.
Yeah, the processes operate, but because
Right.
exactly understand how the processes happen, what happens is certain processes operate on some person, some situation, and sometimes they don't.
Right.
And we are at loss as to why this has not happened. So we don't really have a detailed knowledge. Let us say, for example, the whole idea of mantra recitation. Some people do the mantra recitation and they get what they want. Many people do recitation, nothing happens to them.
So
Take for
mantra is a tool, but then how the tool comes handy to the person,
yeah. So then
that becomes important.
there are 3-4 reasons why it happens. First is it's an inexact science in that sense. In the sense we don't, for example, take the herbal ingestions which are taken. They may be hallucinogenic or they may be non-hallucinogenic. Hallucinogenic. They may be non those kind of things. But herbal preparations have been taken for hundreds of years to induce certain psychological and spiritual experiences. Now, we don't know the exact biochemistry of how that operates. And the outcome of that is that at times they operate and at times they don't operate. So certain things operate at 60-70% probability. Certain things operate at 20-25% probability. And we are not able to know why, or we are not able to enhance the probability of 25 to 70 or to 75 to 90. So
See,
that,
but that is that depends on the person doing it. I mean, the guru or the guide who is doing it can figure out exactly why it is not working on a particular individual and why it is working in a particular individual.
so that is the second element. The first element is the very nature of the science, the inexactness of the science. And the inexactness happens because it is trying to do something way ahead of where our regular science is. Because you are operating almost parallel to philosophy in an applied sense. So philosophy does not have to prove, I mean, generate results on the ground, but spirituality has to show results on the ground. And in that sense, it is operating far ahead of where our regular sciences are. That is part one, the nature of the science itself being inexact. The second variable which comes in is the person who is the guru. Because uh, quite a large quantum of this knowledge is intuitively gained. And because it is intuitively gained and all of that is not documented in a scripture, the scriptures either have certain parts missing or they are not exhaustive enough and they are more like essential sciences rather than comprehensive sciences. Now, when you have that nature of scriptures and much of the knowledge being intuitively grasped by reading the scripture or by life experience, the second variable of the guru becomes very important. And that creates
Yes,
another element
exactly.
of variation. The third element which comes is the person himself, his sincerity, his personality, his pathology, his karmic load, his journey of life, and so on. So that becomes a third important variable. And then there are many other variables at play. If you look at this whole canvas, it is very difficult for a person to sort of self-learn and do it yourself kind of. So very few people can pull it off in a do-it-yourself mode. Most people need it because of these reasons and many other reasons, that we don't have exact details. We don't have many of the things which are experiential, and only an experienced person can provide us guidance. And then the variables that we bring to the table ourselves. In my own life, I could have never developed whatever clarity I have had I not met my teachers and my gurus. Because meeting them was very useful, and it's almost like 100 steps ahead in a single meeting. Because what they gave me was the concentrate of their experience and knowledge. And this was a distilled experience of years of their search. And they give me an essential form, not in comprehensive.
I think that's also the meeting or the experience itself is transformative.
Yes.
And one
Because
can always use and develop one's own tools with the help of those transformative experiences, I feel.
one of the important elements there is the believability of it. Because when I met one person whom I regard as one of my gurus, but I have been with him only once or twice for maybe half an hour, maybe 3 times I think. But and I think last 15 years I have never been to him. But what he said still rings in my mind and comes out to be true. And one of the things that really had a profound impact on me was the way he lived. He was not doing any work, any profession. People would come to him, put some questions and put some money and go. And he told me that existence will take care of you if you are authentic enough. And for me, it was a very profound experience to see that somebody can actually live like this. Because if I had not seen it, I would have never believed it. So one is the very believability of it, that what they claim is, can you actually see it in them? And even if you see a part of it, it's very helpful and transformative for you. The second is, of course, the distillation of their knowledge and experience. And the third is the occult power, which occasionally they use, and they use it to your benefit. So these are some of the elements, and there are many more elements to it, of secret knowledge, of certain secret occult powers and all of that. All of that actually brings in the guru element, that for 95% of people, and yes, at times in life you are surrounded by such difficulties that you need almost a superhuman help to get out of it. And in those times also, the guru is of great help, even in ordinary worldly matters. So to me, it appears that for 95% of people, somebody or the other, or maybe many gurus, are essential for their progress, their knowledge and transformation.
So I think tools or practices are directly linked to the availability of the guru or the person. helps you through the process.
Slightly complex because there is a possibility that in most cases the guru gives the tools. But in many cases, the tools which are suitable to the person are such that the guru has to only give distant guidance and leave the person to practice.
Right.
So that is a different situation. Or the guru can send you to somebody else. That also is a different situation. But I think in the supervision of a guru, it's much easier and safer than otherwise.
Okay, Himanshuji. Thank you for this very stimulating conversation on spirituality and unconscious. When if time permitted, we could have gone in much longer, but I think the time is up.
Right.
And thank you so much again. And do write to us at hvindia@gmail.com. Namaste.
Namaste.